Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Sleep Masterclass, The Science of Sleep and Why It Matters. I'm delighted to have you all here today. Today's session is truly global. We have everyone here in the room today. We also have viewers on YouTube Live, Weibo, and in fact, one of our speakers is going to be doing this remotely today. We're going to look at the science of sleep and why it matters. So thinking particularly around how to guide us through looking at the importance of sleep for our brains, why do we sleep, why is it that sleep helps us remember things, why do we get sleepy, and we'll also look to the impact of poor sleep and what we can do about it. So I'm your facilitator for today. I'm Drew Linforth. I'm the Assistant Director of Student Services here at the University of Birmingham, and I have a responsibility for wellbeing and mental health support here at the university. Our two speakers today are, first of all, in the room with us, Andy Bagshaw. Andy has worked at the University of Birmingham since 2005, where he's a Professor of Imaging Neuroscience and Co-Director at the Centre for Human Brain Health. His main research interest is developing and applying non-invasive brain imaging methods to understand how the brain is affected by epilepsy and sleep. And then online today we have Andrew Surtees. Andrew is currently an Assistant Professor in Psychology at the University and a Clinical Psychologist with Birmingham Women's and Children's NHS Foundation Trust. In his research, he is most interested in how variability in everyday experiences like sleep and anxiety affect our social understanding. He leads research work trying to understand the experiences of neurotypical and neurodiverse children and adults. So, I said today's session is truly global, and it really is, but we want to make sure that everyone who's viewing it today has the opportunity to interact with both our speakers and with each other, to learn a bit more about ourselves. So if I can ask you to pull out your phones, whether you're online or in the room, and go to slido.com, just up there. When you get to slido.com, it will ask you to type in a code. The code clearly, obviously, is 957-992. Really important that you do this because it gives you a couple of different opportunities. First one is our Q&A at the end of the session. All of the questions you'll need to submit through there. You can do so anonymously. When they come through, it will come through to everyone. You'll be able to see them and you'll be able to vote up the questions that you most want asked at the end of the session to our speakers. And I'll be doing that towards the end. Partway through the session as well, we'll also be doing polls, asking questions of the audience, and getting a better understanding around your experiences of sleep and how and why you think it matters. And our guest speakers will talk you through that as well. At the end of the session, you may have seen them out the front. For those of you that were able to register to get a sleep pack, you'll be able to collect them at the end. Okay? So, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Andy.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for coming, everyone. I am just going to sit here, if you don't mind. If you do wind up stopping us, just sit here anyway. So the plan is for me to talk a little bit about the background to sleep so we're all on the same page in terms of what we mean. We'll then have the Slido session where there's a few questions, obvious questions I guess, but just something we can get a conversation going about your particular sleep habits and the outcomes of poor sleep. And then Andy Surtees is going to talk a little bit more about the outcomes of poor sleep in more detail, plus a few suggestions about how you can improve your sleep. So let's start from the beginning. I guess most fundamentally, how do we know whether this is a sleeping cat or a cat with its eyes closed? In principle, and I guess most fundamentally, the only real way to do this that's absolutely unambiguous is to measure its brain activity. So you'd need to, there's too much fur, so you'd probably need to shave its scalp a little bit and put little electrodes onto its scalp. People tend not to like it if you do that to their cats. So we really need some measure that's more behavioural. We will come back to the brain side of things, don't worry about it, because I have a tendency to talk more about the brain than anything else. But we want a behavioural measure that we can apply across species and in all kinds of diverse situations. It's not always possible to measure brain activity. And this is the most accepted definition that we have. I think most people would probably agree with this. And as you can see for yourselves, it's not really controversial. You have this immobility. Generally during sleep you don't move a huge amount. You certainly move less than you would during wakefulness unless you've got a sleep disorder, something like a sleepwalking, something like that. you're less responsive to the outside world. So the outside world is still there. The information about the outside world is still coming into your brain. You know, your ears are still open. Your eyes might be closed, but they're still able to acknowledge that there's differences in luminance, but you don't respond to those changes in the external environment in the same way that you would during wakefulness. You are much less responsive. Something about the brain has changed in order to allow you to do that. But we have this rapid reversibility. You can be in the deepest sleep that you're ever going to be in, and if someone comes right next to your ear and claps their hands or shouts your name, you're going to wake up within about 500 milliseconds or a second. You might feel groggy, you might not feel great. It'll take you a while to get back to where you wanted to be, but it is reversible. And that feature there is to distinguish sleep from coma, essentially, and other kinds of disorders of consciousness. And we need to distinguish sleep from circadian rhythmicity. So circadian rhythmicity is any kind of change in activity that happens over the 24-hour cycle. So we have, over the 24-hour cycle, periods of light, periods of dark, and your activity is generally geared towards, for us as diurnal animals, the periods of light. Other animals are nocturnal, and their activity is geared towards the night time. But that's not necessarily sleep, and it's something separate to sleep. It interacts with sleep, but it is something different. And we can tell that because we can ask the question of whether plants sleep. Now, plants do show these circadian variations in their activity, both behaviourally. Don't necessarily think of plants having that much behavioural, but they do open their leaves, they do move their branches, and at a cellular level, the processes that are necessary to keep the plant going, they change over the 24-hour cycle in alignment with the light-dark cycle. So we have those variations. But if you ask the question whether plants sleep, probably nearly everyone would agree that they don't. Sleep is something different. Sleep is mostly a reorganisation of brain activity that goes in the periods of lack of activity in the circadian cycle. So when you're in the period where you're going to be less active, then sleep comes on top of that, timed by the periods of activity and rest that are defined by the light-dark cycle and defined by circadian rhythmicity. So we've got these two interacting processes determining your sleep patterns. If we ask the question, what is sleep for? It's not always clear. We'll go through some of the main hypotheses that are there. Most people would agree that really a lot of the reason that sleep is there at all is for the brain. And I guess that comes out of the fact that really it's brain activity that changes in a most profound way when you fall asleep. And the way in which we actually define sleep tends to be related to brain activity. The heart does change its activity a bit, the liver changes its activity a bit, but the only organ in the body that really fundamentally changes what it does is the brain. So that leads you towards the idea that maybe sleep is there for the brain. And this is a quote from that paper that's cited on the bottom right-hand side of the slide. If you want any more reading, there's some citations there. But really, we've got these 2 points. One is that sleep is an active process. The brain and the rest of the body are not shut down during sleep. They're still very active. And that sleep is a reorganisation of brain activity. Something different is happening. We can measure that. We can try to characterise it. We don't always understand why it's there or the precise details, but we can certainly come to this conclusion. And we know that sleep makes you vulnerable. If you're this sheep and you're asleep, things can attack you. And, you know, when our own sleep patterns evolved millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we were also vulnerable when we were asleep. There was things out there that were likely to attack us. So given that, what are the advantages? There have to be advantages, otherwise sleep would not be there. And these are the 3 main hypotheses for why sleep is there. And I'll briefly explain a little bit more about what they actually represent, what they actually mean. So the first idea, adaptive inactivity, you can imagine it to be suggesting that sleep is like a mini hibernation. It's not hibernation, and hibernation physiologically is something very different, but the principle is the same. That when you don't have something more important to do, you put yourself somewhere safe. You put yourself out of harm's way, you save some energy, and then when the circumstances in the world go back to what is optimal, so in our case, the sun comes up, we need to do things to keep ourselves alive, then we come back into activity and start to do those things that are necessary. So in that sense, sleep in this way is a relatively passive process, doesn't relate to brain activity or anything like that, but it really sort of gets us to the idea of why sleep is happening at the times of day that it might be happening, because we're really trying to optimise our activity. And there's a link here with some of that circadian rhythmicity that we talked about. The second hypothesis, plasticity, which basically from our point of view mainly means things like learning and memory. And there's a lot of work out there, a lot of evidence that memory in particular needs sleep. And in order to learn what you've been through during the day and put that down into a long-term store, sleep can help with that. It's not the only way that happens, but sleep can certainly help with that process and allow you to lay down those memories, allow you to make connections that lead you to have better performance on the following day. A lot of that seems to occur during sleep. And if you go without sleep, that does generally, the converse being that if you go without sleep, those processes tend to fall apart, and the more you go without sleep, the worse they get. And the final one, which is more at the cellular level, this suggests that wakefulness is placing high demands on cells in the brain, but throughout the body. It's using the energy stores, it's using the molecules that are necessary to keep cells going. And during sleep, those molecules, those energy stores are replenished within the cells, and toxic byproducts of cellular activity are washed out. And again, there's evidence from animal and human literature that this is also going on. So we've got those three hypotheses. We're not really looking at one hypothesis that's going to explain every aspect of sleep. We're not saying that one of these ideas is true and the others are not true. Really what we're talking about is probably these are several processes that are pushing us towards sleep and allowing us to really achieve some benefit from sleep. And all organisms that sleep are probably achieving this, maybe in different proportions, maybe for some animals and at some stages of development, these hypotheses become more or less important, more or less relevant to the drive to sleep. But they are there and they are helping you to achieve something beneficial from sleep. So how do we define sleep in humans? Well, I guess we do it with electrodes on the scalp. And if we do this, so we'd have, this is a technique called polysomnography, which means basically that you're measuring multiple different physiological variables that are relevant for sleep. You've got some electrodes on the scalp to measure brain activity. You've got some electrodes under the chin to measure muscle activity. And you've got some electrodes near the eye to measure eye activity. And all of those pieces of information are used to define the stages of sleep. And through the night, you go through those stages of sleep several times. This is really pointing again towards the fact that the kind of activity that we're measuring here, and predominantly the brain activity, is changing rhythmically throughout the course of the night. It's taking us into several different stages, several different states of consciousness as we go through the night. And I won't dwell on this one too much because that might take us a little bit too much time, but just to point out that for each of these stages, so we've got wakefulness, shows with characteristic activity on those different measures of physiological variables. But then we've got non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep, two fundamentally different states. And then non-rapid eye movement sleep is split into N1 and N2 and N3, again, defined by different types of activity. This is, we could put those electrodes on any one of you, you would show this kind of activity. We would be able to sleep stage your sleep. We would be able to show how you're going through the night, how your brain activity and your muscle activity is changing throughout the night. And this is really showing us, because some of these variables, some of these features that we're measuring, they're just not there during wakefulness. So things like sleep spindles, K-complexes, vertex sharp waves, they're strange kinds of activity that occur on the EEG, so the electrodes that are measuring brain activity, that do not occur during wakefulness. Your brain is suddenly able, as soon as you fall asleep, to throw out different types of activity than it would be when it was awake. What those types of activity represent, what they're there for, why they even exist, is still very active research area. There's a lot of people trying to figure that out. Let's turn to, I guess, one of the more practical questions about how much sleep is normal, how much sleep you should be getting. It's not an easy question to answer. And both of these figures here, the one on the left is about how much sleep. The ones on the right relate to what your sleep should look like in terms of how quickly you should fall asleep and how many times in the night you should wake up, essentially. These studies were done by asking some experts, so some people who worked clinically with sleep, how much sleep do you think people should be getting? What do you think their sleep should be looking like? And what we see is variation. What we see is those experts, from their experience, and you'll know this from your own experience from talking to other people, there is variability. The amount of sleep you need is not necessarily the amount of sleep another person needs. The amount of time it takes you to fall asleep may be different to how long it takes someone else to fall asleep. That's just the way it is. I mean, we have very individualised sleep patterns, and we should accept that and we should embrace that. What you'll also see with the figure on the left-hand side is that as we go through our lives from early childhood to very old age, our sleep patterns will change. And what the experts are saying there, that's mirrored. They get their experience from talking to people and measuring the activity of people. There are differences in how much sleep you would expect a 5-year-old to get from a 95-year-old. And again, some of those processes are understood, some of them are not. There is the suggestion that people's sleep patterns as they get older might be contributing to some of the cognitive difficulties that older people experience. Whether that's true is still, again, an active area of research. But this idea that we shouldn't expect there to be a single number. We shouldn't expect one number to say how much sleep, what should each person's sleep look like. It doesn't exist, and I think we should be willing to accept that. There's also this idea that our sleep over the past 20 years, particularly with the rise of consumer electronics, is getting much worse. And there's studies out there that have addressed that particular question. You know, is sleep, as we're experiencing it now, is it worse? Is it different to what it was like 50 years ago or 200 years ago? This study looked at the available literature, and basically it looked at studies that reported how much sleep people have, and then it looked to see whether they change over the decades. It essentially found that they hadn't, and as you can see from that quote, they point out that 200, 500 years ago, people had a lot of different issues to face when they were sleeping that we don't have now, suggesting that maybe our sleep wouldn't be expected to have got worse. And there's other studies where people have gone to pre-industrial societies and looked at their sleep. And again, they're not massively different to what we're experiencing in industrial societies. So I think the idea that we are kind of going through this epidemic of terrible sleep, I'm not necessarily sure the evidence points towards that quite as strongly as sometimes it's stated. Just to make that point finally, individual susceptibility, we all need different amounts of sleep, but we're also individually susceptible to reductions in our amount of sleep. So some of us are able to cope with sleep deprivation, some of us are able to cope with poor quality sleep and still be okay the next day, some of us are not. Equally, we're not very good at judging that. So you can ask people, and that's what they did in these studies, they kind of asked people how sleepy they were, and then they asked people how impaired they thought they were, or they tested them cognitively in terms of identifying how impaired people were. People are not good at judging how impaired they are by sleep deprivation. Even though you sort of objectively have experienced sleep deprivation, you might think you're fine. And that ties into kind of public broadcast message of don't drive when you're sleep deprived, because your performance does go down and you don't judge it very well. And there's a rise in car accidents when people are sleep deprived, or in the early hours of the night when people probably should be sleeping. So that's all I want to say. Basically, sleep is there across the animal kingdom. And you can go into jellyfish and there's evidence, not there's anything wrong with jellyfish, but they are relatively simple organisms compared to vertebrates, and there's still evidence that they sleep. So sleep is important enough to be conserved across all available species. Exactly what it looks like changes a lot, and maybe the purpose of it might also change, but the fundamental feature that is sleep does change is there across the animal kingdom. There's nothing really that gets better with inadequate sleep. However you look at it, I've never seen anything that would suggest here's a process, here's a function that gets better if you sleep less. Everything gets worse, essentially, and achieving adequate sleep for you is the way to go, absolutely, for sure, and Andy will talk a bit more about that. And this idea about individuality in terms of how much sleep you need, but also how impaired you get with sleep and how you can judge that yourself, I think it's worth bearing that in mind. When people say you need 8 hours sleep, you might do, and most people do, but you might get away with 6.5 hours sleep, and that, if that works for you and you feel rested, that's all there is to it. There's no point worrying about that you are not getting enough, because if you feel rested, you are getting enough. And that is all I want to say. We'll now move on to the Slido questions, which I have cunningly tucked behind me. So the first of them is, how much sleep do you think you get on an average night? So if you can fill that in, then hopefully Slido will give us a distribution there. What we've done with those categories is go, I guess, with the most common categories that you would expect. So you wouldn't expect many people to be experiencing or achieving less than 5 hours sleep a night. Less than 5 hours sleep a night. If I wanted to do a sleep deprivation experiment and I wanted to compare sleep deprived people with normally rested people, I could do less than 5 hours of sleep. No one would argue that that is definitely sleep deprived, because there's virtually no one who can cope with less than 5 hours, even less than 6 hours sleep. And over 10 hours, again, it's not usual, it's not common. And we can see that with what's coming through here. So we've got 7 to 8 hours as most common, 8 to 9, 6 to 7. We have that distribution. This again goes back to the idea that we have each of our individual patterns that we need to follow. Shall we go to the next question, which is, what do you think your biggest barrier to sleep is? And that's going to be a word cloud. So as you put your responses in, we should get a word cloud coming up. Coffee, noise and housemates, especially noisy housemates drinking coffee. Housemates is coming strongly. So what we're seeing there, we've got a lot of environmental issues like noise and housemates. So if you want to achieve the sleep that you really would like to be achieving, the environment that you put in place is going to be particularly important. So some of these things you can control. So you can control your own space, I guess. You can make your space as ready for sleep as necessary. Things like housemates, things like noise, sometimes there's less you can do about that. But then we also have internal aspects like stress, like anxiety, overthinking. Again, pointing towards there's the external triggers that can impact on your sleep and make it worse, but there's also things internally, again, things you can work on. So making sure that you don't think about stressful things, don't experience stressful things as much as possible just before bed. That's going to be important for you to try and get the amount of sleep that you would want to get. And to be honest, the words there become smaller than I can read, so we shall move on to the next question, which is, what do you think the biggest impact of a bad night's sleep is for you? So I've seen now some aspects where people's sleep might be negatively impacted. Now, what's the outcome of that? What are we actually going to experience? The noise, the tiredness, the irritability, headache, lack of concentration. And again, so we've got things like issues around mood, and Andy will talk a bit more about that. And there's a lot of evidence out there that this is very common. This is exactly what you'd expect to see, that people's mood is going down. Cognitive abilities, ability to concentrate, so that goes back to sort of don't drive when you're sleep deprived, because you can't concentrate as well and you can't achieve the sort of level of performance that you'd like to be able to achieve. The tiredness itself, I guess an obvious one, but is probably the most negative outcome. I mean, it's just unpleasant to live through the day when you're tired. And that can come out of if you look at sort of diagnoses of sleep disorders, that will obviously come around all the time, tiredness. It's just a question of identifying where it comes from and what it might be triggered by. So let's go to the final question. What's your normal bedtime? And again, this is trying to get to another aspect of sleep. We've talked about the duration of sleep and the variability in that. Now we'll say, what's the timing of sleep? So this comes to the fact that we all have, and this really relates to that circadian aspect that I talked about earlier. So the circadian aspect which really controls the timing of our activity. Some people will naturally go to bed earlier, some people will naturally go to bed later. 11 p.m. seems to be coming out pretty common. We've got 12. That again comes out quite realistically. 3 a.m. I was hoping some people had come up with 3 a.m. So people who, there are people who naturally would want to go to bed at that kind of time of the day. You know, in the same way that we have variability in everything else, and these aspects are driven by multiple genetic factors as well as behavioural factors, so there's a huge amount of variability. Some people naturally would just go to bed at 3 a.m. And that's really where the societal day can impact on those people. It tends to be people who go to bed with very late sleep patterns who experience the most negative outcomes because they hit the societal day. So if they have to get to a 9 o'clock lecture, or if they have to go to a job at 9 o'clock, the length of time they can have for sleeping is not particularly long. You know, if you go to bed at 3 and you've got to get up at 8, you've got 5 hours sleep. And 5 hours sleep, I don't think anyone said they wanted to have 5 hours sleep and that was what they normally wanted. So we have that interaction between your preference for sleep timing, the amount of time you can get, the societal day imposing some barriers, and then all of those negative outcomes. So all of those negative outcomes we talked about on the previous question, people who go to bed much later are much more likely to have those negative outcomes. And the majority of that is probably driven by the fact that they tend to get less sleep. So it's good to see that most people are going to bed at a reasonable time that leaves them enough of a duration to get the amount of sleep that they need. And we were seeing like the 8 or 9 hours sleep, if you're going to do that and fit in with any kind of sort of societal day, then that's really the time you need to be going to bed. I suspect in the interest of time, some of these aspects Andy will be coming back to, and he'll really be talking a bit more about some of the negative outcomes and some of the issues around sleep and some of the optimization. So we've got some questions. Are we doing those at the end?
We're going to do those at the end.
Perfect. So should we go over to Andy now? Perfect. Who is hopefully there, unfortunately couldn't be with us. You could probably guess the reason. It's going around quite a lot at the minute.
All good.
You okay, Andy? Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. So whenever you want to share your screen,
I'm trying to, but it's disabled, unfortunately.
you're just going to have to do it off the top of your head then.
I can do it off the top of my head, but yeah. I had some pictures of sloths, so people are going to want to see those.
Yeah, okay.
Chris will do it here.
Chris is doing it from here. So do you want to just say next slide when?
He's got a different set of slides to me, so that's not going to work.
Right, okay. Well, this is
could enable screen sharing.
technically challenging. Is there any way of allowing him to have screen sharing rights? Just chat amongst yourselves for a moment. Would it be worth me having a quick, while you're doing that, talking through a few of these questions?
Yeah, I think that'd be really helpful.
We could do that, assuming I can read them. I thought my glasses were quite good, but then it turns out that laptop's quite a long way away. Oh, it's dreams. How and why do dreams occur in relation to sleep? Perfect. To be honest, I think that's a virtually unanswerable. That always is. So I have given a 10-week module on sleep, and I talked as little about dreams as I possibly could because I think it's not something that's very well understood at all. So we have the slides. So do we want to, shall I? Okay, fine. I'll continue babbling about dreams. I think it's very unclear. So I think in many ways dreams would be your perception of the brain activity that is occurring at the different sleep stages. So we've seen that brain activity isn't stopping at different sleep stages, it's reorganising itself. In some way, presumably, you are able to perceive what that activity is doing. I personally am not convinced by many of the theories that have been put down for why dreams are there, much beyond that. So there's a lot of suggestions for why dreams are there. There's not many suggestions that have a huge amount of evidence behind them. And I guess partly that's because it's quite difficult to actually study dreams as kind of a subjective experience that you are having in a state of consciousness where your subjectivity and your ability to report what's happening is completely changed. This is not easy activity to study very robustly. And so personally, you'll find people who would be more keen to say why dreams are there. Personally, I'd say I'm not quite sure. And it looks like I'm glad I'm taking off dreams. That's good. Thank you for that. Thank you for saving me for that. We can maybe talk about that later if anyone wants to.
Yeah. He's on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Brilliant. I can hear me, so that will do. So apologies again that I'm not there in person today. As Andy hinted, I've got COVID, unfortunately, and sat at home doing that. And it might be that we get some questions later about potentially the impact on the COVID pandemic sleep. So it's really interesting in the sense that COVID has changed the way, at least the periods we do things as societies, which has made us think about things like sleep in a different way. So if you take one thing away from today, it's that sleep matters. So we'd like to suggest you should be potentially prioritising sleep when you are. So the questions that you've just been asked might have had you thinking about how you prioritise sleep. So if you have a list of things that are important to you, where do you put sleep? So do you ever choose, for instance, to catch up on work instead, so cram for exams, or to try and meet a deadline, for instance? Do you miss sleep to enjoy your social life, to go out with friends? Do you ever miss sleep to try and do something which will be relaxing or maybe good for you? And kind of my suggestion really is not always that sleep should necessarily be at the top of the list on this, but that what we know is that by choosing not to prioritize sleep, you're actually impacting all of those other things that you might be putting above it. So I'm going to talk you through bit by bit, but there's evidence now really that poor sleep seems to make us less physically healthy, less mentally healthy. It makes us perform worse at most of the things that you probably care about performing well at, and it makes us less socially motivated and less socially competent. So again, not suggesting sleep always has to be number one, but that really that sleep plays a role in all of these things. As Andy said previously, what counts as good or normal sleep for an individual is obviously different. So we're not always brilliant at knowing how much sleep we need, but how much we need might differ between different people. But equally, we can look at trends across the population as a way of understanding the relationship between sleep and, for instance, physical health. So in terms of physical health outcomes, there's not really a much bigger one than mortality, so how likely you are to die. And what we know really now across a lot of studies is those people who are averaging fewer than 7 hours of sleep or averaging more than 9 hours of sleep are more likely to die over a given period than those who are falling in that middle ground. And the important thing, I think, to think about here is not to get terrified if you're one of those people who are sleeping 6 hours or 5 hours or 10 hours or whatever, but it's to think about the kind of potential mechanisms and factors that play into that. So on the one hand, we have things like potentially the impact on your chances of having things like long-term conditions if you're not getting enough sleep for you, but also potentially differences in sleep as kind of a sort of marker that things might not be quite right at the moment. So for instance, needing 10 hours of sleep a night without feeling okay might be evidence actually that something's not quite right for you physically at the moment. With one of the most common links between sleep differences and physical health problems being with obesity. So lots of studies are now showing that people who average fewer than 7 hours a night are up to 50% more likely to end up meeting the criteria for obesity than those who average more than that. And again here, the important thing might be mechanism. So thinking, as most of us kind of know in a sense, that if we're not getting much sleep, we often crave foods that are fattier or have more carbohydrate in them. We are less motivated to engage in activities, so things like exercise. And then that can lead to us being overweight. And obviously we know then that has a kind of cascading impact on other aspects of our physical health. And as well as physical health, we know that poor sleep or sleep deprivation has an impact on our mental health and well-being. So we know that sleep makes it harder to understand and regulate and control our emotions. We know that sleep deprivation actually lowers mood, so you're more likely to be sadder at a given time or more anxious. But also we know things work the other way, that if you are experiencing emotional difficulties, if you're anxious or low in mood, then that will impact your sleep as well. So anxiety typically reduces sleep, depression, it can kind of go either way. And we know over lots of epidemiological studies that high levels of anxiety are more likely to be associated with high levels of sleep, and the same for depression. So we see this as an individual on a day-to-day basis. We feel worse if we slept badly, but also we see this in the long term, that people who are having sleep problems for a period are more likely to go on to get a diagnosis of something like an anxiety or depressive disorder. But this doesn't just go for those people who meet criteria for a mental health condition. We actually see this in our everyday population as well. So over the last couple of years, we've done some questionnaire studies with our undergraduate psychology students. And one of the things we've asked people to do is fill in questionnaires on sleep and anxiety. So in a decent sized sample of psychology students, we have this great big correlation between those people who report high levels of sleep problems and high levels of anxiety. And that's basically a kind of linear relationship. So the worse your sleep gets, basically, the more anxious you're likely to be. And this correlation of, over 0.5 is probably a little bit bigger than people normally find, for instance, between the relationship between, for instance, IQ and exam results. So essentially, if I know how you're sleeping, I'm going to be able to predict your levels of anxiety better than I would be able to predict your exam grades if I knew how clever you were. And obviously, as well as our health, we know that sleep affects our performance day to day. So it affects our ability to do things in our daily lives. And most of us will notice and recognize that when we've had less sleep, we are less vigilant or less alert. So things get past us. And we even kind of use awake as a sort of synonym for being alert, really. But what we perhaps think about less is the impact of poor sleep or sleep deprivation on our more complex cognitive abilities. So this is a bit of an old study now, but I quite like it in that what it did was it had people take part in a study where they measured performance on a task which looked at psychomotor performance and vigilance. So a task that kind of mirrored a lot of the things we have to do when we drive a car, for instance. And it compared performance between people who had been without sleep and people who were asked to drink alcohol. And what they showed is after about 10 hours without sleep, so for most of us kind of a sort of mid-late afternoon point, performance started dropping off. So again, as Andy mentioned earlier, this might not be the sort of thing we'd even notice. And at these low levels, it's probably not a problem. But the interesting thing is, as time went on without sleep, the performance directly followed the path we see when people drink alcohol. And so what they were essentially showing is that if somebody had got up at 7 o'clock, their performance would start getting worse by 3 in the afternoon. By about 10 o'clock in the evening, they'd be around the level of the people who'd been asked to have 2 standard drinks of alcohol. And by 3:30 in the morning, they were crossing the legal threshold in that equivalent performance. And most of us don't drive very often at 3:30 in the morning, but we might after a late night shift, for instance, in a bar or something along those lines. And again, it's not trying to sort of punish or suggest that people who are driving at these times are wrong, but rather we need to know this information if we're going to make these judgments, because we can't always tell just by thinking in ourselves about how alert and awake we are. So many of us know that caffeine as a drug could be a sort of magic cure to our feelings of sleepiness. It has lots of other problems as well. But what we're starting to learn more about and know more about is that what caffeine does when we're sleepy is it can restore some of those feelings of alertness and vigilance. What it seems not to do is restore what we call the higher cognitive functions. So these are our abilities to do more complex cognitive work, to plan things, to think about what our goals are, to make good decisions. And these are the sorts of abilities I'm particularly interested in, because most of my research looks at the relationship between sleep and social interaction or social cognition. So human beings are obviously social animals, and these complex cognitive abilities we put in place in our social interactions all the time. And for most of us, some of the most important things in our life are how these social interactions go. So actually, if you look at people's motivations for sometimes things like work and things like that, it's often to get money to provide for a family and have those meaningful relationships, or to gain status within our society, for instance. And sleep seems to be crucially linked to these social processes. So in the simplest sense, a lack of sleep and sleepiness seems to decrease our social motivation. So the kind of key graph here is the one on the bottom right, and you may not be able to see this, but along the bottom we have sleepiness, and up the side we have somebody's desire to engage in a certain behavior or activity. And the red line is the desire to be with other people, and the blue line is the desire to be on your own. And what it shows is this really neat cross where the sleepier you get, the more likely you want to be on your own, and the less likely you want to be with others. So depriving yourself of sleep is making you want to be on your own and not engage and interact and build those relationships that are probably so important to you. And a recent study by Ettinger, Simon and colleagues looked at what might be going on in the brain that might relate to this. And in a kind of, I guess, simple take on what they showed was that they had people who were sleep deprived and sleep rested, and they showed them videos of a character approaching them. And then they did MRI scanning where they looked at different regions of the brain and their responsiveness to these images. And what they showed was that for the sleep rested participants, for people having a good night's sleep, there was more activation in the area of the brain known as the theory of mind network. So this is the parts of the brain that are associated with thinking about other people's beliefs, other people's desires, other people's intentions. The sleep deprived participant, on the other hand, showed more activation in what's sometimes called the near space network. So that's a network that, at least in part, is associated with thinking about your own personal space and whether somebody else might be too close, for instance. So we have this picture that when you're rested, you're preparing to interact and think about somebody else and their mental states. When you're sleep deprived, what you might be is wary, actually, that a person approaching you might be a physical threat. And alongside this, not only does it seem to be the case that sleep deprivation makes us less likely to want to interact with others, it also seems to want others less interested in interacting with us. So these are two pictures of the same guy. I hope that's fairly obvious. On the right, he is sleep deprived, and on the left, he is rested. And what was found when showing people pictures like this is people consistently vote the guy on the right as being less attractive and less healthy than the guy on the left when they give ratings about these factors. So we have this picture that while some of us sleep deprive ourselves to engage in social activity, if we are sleep depriving, we are making us less socially motivated, less socially engaged, and less attractive to other people. And again, these patterns seem to be pulled out when we ask people to report their own social difficulties and their own sleep problems. So this again is our undergraduate psychology students, about 180 of them. And along the bottom, we have sleep problems, and up the side, we have social difficulties. And we have a nice linear relationship between the two. So that is the people with more sleep problems were reporting that they also had more social difficulties. So not every single one, but as a group, that nice pattern's there. And interestingly, within this, these sorts of questionnaires also allow us to look at potentially the proportion of people in our student population who seem to be reporting things consistent with sleep problems. So on the Pittsburgh Index, which is kind of probably the most used sleep questionnaire out there, we have around 62% of our undergraduates reporting things that might be considered to be a sleep problem. Now, that's not to suggest that all of these people have a sleep disorder or need to be rushing to their GP to get advice, but it's probably reasonable to say that each of these people might benefit from thinking more about their sleep patterns and how they engage with sleep. And the sorts of things that might tell you if you're one of these people might be that you might be getting less than 7 hours a night of sleep. So again, it's different between different people, but that might be a starting point to think, actually, am I not getting enough? You might be struggling to get to sleep or stay asleep. You might be feeling tired or irritable during the day, as people said in the word cloud, or have problems concentrating. Quickly, in terms of what we might do about that, obviously, as we've been saying today, the first thing might be to prioritize sleep. So again, in life, we have decisions to make, choices to make about what's important. And what I'd like to suggest to you is by prioritizing sleep, you're also prioritizing all these other things that matter too. You need to let your body know when it's time to sleep. So as Andy talked about, that circadian rhythm is partly based on the things that are going on around you. So it's based on light, but also based on what you're doing, the cues you're giving it that it's time to sleep. So keeping a regular bed and wake time helps, having a bedtime routine, and also having an environment that's set up for sleep as well. You need to think about relaxing. So the reason why anxiety, at least in part, is associated with poor sleep is those levels of arousal go up and make it harder to sleep. So try and do something relaxing before bedtime. Try and avoid blue light in that hour or so before bedtime. What you might find if you've got these racing thoughts and things that are on your mind, you might want to make a to-do list for the following day, things that you need to take action with. Try and avoid caffeine anywhere near bedtime as well. And most of us actually are quite good at not drinking coffee at sort of 10 o'clock at night. But we don't often think that if we have a coffee at 5 o'clock at night, half of the caffeine is still going to be in our system at 10 o'clock. Equally, obviously, we don't want to force it. So worrying about sleep can cause sleep problems as and of itself. So last of all, just that last bit was kind of a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but we're mainly thinking today about people improving their sleep who don't necessarily have a kind of sleep disorder. So if you think you have a really significant problem, it might be that you want to look at advice online from the NHS or talk to your general practitioner. So I think we're going to go into the questions bit, and there seems to be quite a few going through. So thank you very much for listening. Again, sorry for not being there.
Andrew, a really insightful talk. Okay, over to the Q&A. Don't forget to use Slido to vote up the questions that you most want asked. We've started with one already, particularly around dreams. So the next top one is, does oversleeping have any bad effects?
Shall I go first, Andy, and then you can come in if you
want? You
go.
Sure.
I think there is evidence, it's not an easy question, but I think there is evidence that it can. I mean, if you look at some of these relationships between sleep duration and some kind of negative outcome, whether that's kind of poor mental health or poor physical well-being, some of those relationships are not linear, like Andy said. With most of them, they're kind of, as you get worse sleep, as you get less sleep, it tends to kind of everything gets worse. There is some evidence that oversleeping can also have negative impacts. It's much less well studied. And I think Andy said in his talk that there's also some suggestions that oversleeping might be a symptom of something else. So it might not be the problem itself. It might be something that is meaning that after a more normal length of sleep, you're not feeling well rested. You're still feeling like you need more because of some other underlying problem, and that leads you to have additional sleep or seek additional sleep. So I think it is something where if you are kind of off the end of the scale in terms of how much sleep you would habitually need, and that's happening on a regular basis, then yeah, I think that's probably of some concern as well. Anything to add, Andy? Would you agree with that, or would you fundamentally disagree?
Yeah, no, I'd largely agree with that. I mean, it also might depend what you have to do in the morning when you're sleeping as well. So if you're missing things, that might be a problem as well. And I think something a little bit to add that what Andy touched on there was a sense of habitual sleep patterns versus variability as well. So I think what some people sometimes find is, occasional oversleeping with potentially short sleep as well. So sometimes it's evidence that you're not getting enough sleep on the other nights as well. And I guess sometimes it can lead to erratic sleep patterns as well. Most of us can't regularly sleep till 10 o'clock in the morning. Most of us are required to to do something. And then it can be that we end in these sort of weird shifts where some days we're sleeping till late and other days we're having to get up much earlier, and that can be problematic as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm eternally jealous whoever gets the opportunity to do quick naps. But the next question is taking quick naps during the day beneficial or the opposite?
I think, again, it comes back a little bit to what Andy was just saying there about habitual versus on individual days. So it can be evidence, if you need regular naps, it can be evidence that you're just not getting enough sleep in the nighttime sleep period. And then in that case, if it's literally that, and again, maybe we go back to some of the late sleeping people who might impact with societal day and might not get the sleep that they need overnight, then they will habitually be sleep deprived, and therefore the nap might be a kind of beneficial thing that would allow you to regain and get back to the sleep that you'd actually need, which ideally would probably be, you wouldn't necessarily need the nap, but if your lifestyle means that you have to do that or whatever else, then maybe that's a way of catching up on the sleep that you've missed. Again, naps can be evidence that something, you're not getting the restorative sleep, you're not being fully recompensed by the sleep that you're getting, in the same way that if you're sleeping for 10 hours, 11 hours, maybe there's some other underlying issue there that might be worth looking into. I think it can be a bit of both. I mean, it kind of depends how often you're doing those naps and why you're doing those naps. Andy?
Yeah, so I think that there are definitely some tasks where there's evidence that people's performance improves after taking naps, that certainly after they've been sleep deprived the night before. Certainly some of that's restorative. Yeah, again, it might depend how it fits with your lifestyle to some degree. So I do a bit of work on the sleep of new parents, and for those guys in particular, the naps are a godsend. So if you can't sleep at night for a reason, then a nap is probably a good idea. I guess in terms of the other side of my work, where I work in mental health, where people do sometimes have these mental health related sleep problems, then we often try and limit naps, even if they seem to be helpful to the person at the time. Because the problem is, if you're napping during the day and clearing some of what we sleep debt, then when you come down to try and sleep at night, you can't sleep, and then you get into this sort of pattern where everything just goes off.
Brilliant. I'm going to start with you, Andrew, again, if that's okay. The next question, mainly because you referenced it in your presentation, is the issue of blue light before bed a myth? And how useful are blue light filters on technology?
Interesting. So I don't think it's a myth. So I think, so as Andy probably talked about a bit, and I didn't talk too much about today actually, so there are kind of two processes that make you want to sleep. There's the circadian process that kind of goes up and down during the day, and there's what's sometimes called the S-wave process. So the longer you've been awake, you get a pressure to want to go to sleep. And I think, as far as we know, that blue light is a factor that kind of has a particular impact on some of our circadian processes. So light in general, obviously going back to evolutionary time, light, the main thing that told us it was night and it was time to sleep. And I guess light in general, and my understanding is blue light in particular, seems to be a particular cue that today's daytime, effectively, you should be awake. I think probably also one thing that is perhaps either conflated or not talked about enough is people's psychological engagement with the things that the blue light devices they have. So a kind of old-fashioned alarm clock, I think, is often a good sleep measure, because I think people sleeping with their phones, for lots of people, that can be a problem, I think. So sometimes, whether it's the blue light itself or whether it's engaging with all the things that are making your mind busy during the day, both of those are problems. I wouldn't think I had enough expertise on blue light filters to make a strong case on that. I don't know whether Andy has anything to add.
I think basically the receptors in the retina are more sensitive to blue light, particularly the ones that impact on your circadian rhythmicity. So they do have, blue light does have more of an arousing push and more of an ability to set your circadian rhythm. At the same time, you know, if you've got your blue light filter on, but you're doing something exciting on your tablet or phone, and it's arousing anyway, and it's kind of going to keep you awake and not be consistent with you wanting to be relaxing towards bed, towards sleep, then I don't think the blue light filter will save you.
All right, okay, thank you. The next one, which I think is a very popular one probably for all of us at some point, is how to deal with anxiety about not getting enough sleep. When I'm trying to sleep, I'm constantly thinking about how much sleep I'll get and the time counting down. Andy?
I think Andy Surtees should take that first,
Yeah,
given that
okay.
he's clinically qualified, and then I can add some random thoughts.
So clearly it's really difficult. It's a common problem. That's why I took that slide in at the end. So one of, I guess, the best evidence treatments for insomnia is cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia. And one of the things they look to do is try and reduce some of those beliefs around potentially the importance of getting to sleep at a very specific time. I guess, as with any belief and thought process, there are different ways you can engage with that. So I think there's something around, I guess, thinking about what you're doing at a particular time and whether that is going to allow you to change things. So what is often seen in most of the sleep guides actually is you should limit the time you're spending in bed not sleeping. So that is often where the worry about not sleeping happens. So most people, when they're trying to get to sleep, are either worrying about the day, they're worrying about not sleeping, or they're trying to decide if they need a wee or not. That seems to be the sort of three big things people do. And actually, probably once you've got 15 or 20 minutes, you need to get up, you need to do something relaxing, and then you need to go back to bed. So I think limiting the time you allow yourself to do those things is important. I think knowing you've done all you can, so set things in your favour. And then I think doing other things that might be relaxing for you. So some people find mindfulness helping. Some people read before bed. Others, as I say, like to put things to one side. So, for instance, making a list of things you can do the next day. And that in theory should help them sort of clamouring to feel the need, like I must sleep, otherwise I'm not going to be able to get anywhere.
Well, Andy, anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think, I mean, going back to this idea of individual variability, that, you know, it depends what your anxiety about getting enough sleep. Is that enough sleep for you, or are you worrying generally that everyone should get 8 hours sleep and I'm only getting 6.5 hours sleep and therefore this is very bad? Or is it literally that I'm not achieving the sleep I want to and I am tired in the morning? And I think that's kind of a more realistic anxiety, that, you know, you are tired all the time, you're not achieving the sleep that you want all the time. I mean, it's not an easy issue. I mean, I think one thing worth bearing in mind is if you are thinking about duration, that people are not very good at judging their own sleep duration either, and they're not necessarily even very good at judging whether they're awake or asleep, which sounds a little bit surprising. But if there's studies where people where you've got people sleeping and they've got electrodes on, so you can measure the brain activity and know whether they're sleeping or not. And then at periods during the night, you wake them up and basically ask them, were you asleep or were you awake? People are not good at judging that. And certainly in the early stages of sleep, I think it's something like 80% of people, certainly in N1, the very early stage, about 80% of people might say that they are not sleeping, despite the fact that brain-wise, they are sleeping. This is unambiguously sleep from the brain point of view, but subjectively, you're not feeling like you're asleep. And I think that follows through all the way. It becomes, when you're in very deep sleep, it becomes much, obviously the percentages go down of people who don't think they're asleep. But certainly, it's always there. And within people who suffer from insomnia, I think the same issue is there, that they often underestimate how much sleep they're actually getting. So, and then worry about that explicitly. I mean, obviously, if you're not achieving the amount of sleep, you've got all these negative outcomes. Clearly, there is something there. But sometimes I think focusing on the amount is not a particularly helpful metric of whether or not you're getting what you need anyway.
Brilliant, thank you. And
Sorry, just to add, some of
on,
the best evidence for the therapy stuff on this is actually that what you improve is people's realistic estimates. So people's self-reports go up, but their kind of objective measures of sleep don't always. But they also seem to be happy about that. So I think this sense of feeling like you're not getting a specific amount that you should be getting is kind of a common thing.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've had loads of fantastic questions today, but unfortunately that's all we've got time for the question and answer session. Andy and Andrew very kindly offered to put some answers to some of the other questions after the event, which we'll make available. And finally, a massive thank you to everyone for joining us today, both in the room and across the globe, actually. And a big thank you again to our speakers, Andy and Andrew. Thanks, everyone.
It's a good job you stuck us to time.
Do you know what? I wouldn't have done